And the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm honoured to speak at report stage today in support of Bill C-32, the Victims' Bill of Rights Act. This bill will change how victims are to be treated by the criminal justice and corrections systems in Canada. It acknowledges their suffering and recognizes that they too have rights which must be respected. The Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights heard testimony from numerous witnesses who described the importance of this bill. Many shared their own difficult stories of victimization and expressed their appreciation for the changes that the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights will bring to other victims who will follow. The committee also heard from those who provided victims with much-needed services. They too offered their support for the bill and explained that the rights contained in the Canadian Victims Bill of Rights and the accompanying amendments to the Criminal Code and Corrections Conditional Release Act will improve the experiences of victims. Because the Victims' Bill of Rights presents a completely new approach for victims of crime in Canada, there have been many questions about how the bill will actually work and how it will be implemented. This is understandable given its transformative nature. I'd like to take the opportunity today to address three issues that have been the subject of discussions at the Standing Committee. The definition of victim, the steps we will take to ensure awareness of the rights created in Bill C-32, and the enforceability of those rights. Regarding the definition of victim in Bill C-32, the committee heard from witnesses who feel that the definition is overly broad, as well as those who feel that it is under-inclusive. Concern has been expressed about how a definition of victim in federal legislation will coexist with the definitions of victim that are found in provincial and territorial victim legislation. We have also heard questions about why the bill contains more than one definition of victim and what each purports to do. As members will know, Bill C-32 includes the new Canadian Victim Bill of Rights and proposes amendments to 4 federal statutes. The Canadian Victim Bill of Rights proportion of Bill C-32 includes a broad definition of victim. This definition recognizes the various kinds of harm that an individual may suffer as a result of an offense, even if the offense was not committed against them personally. The definition acknowledges that individuals, other than the direct victim, can be victims of an offense. All the rights included in the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights can be exercised by a direct victim, as well as others who have suffered harm, such as their family members. The bill also amends the definition of victim in the Criminal Code and the Corrections and Conditional Release Act to ensure that those definitions align with the definition of victim in the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights. The first part of the proposed definition in the Criminal Code recognizes the same forms of harm as those in the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights that a victim of an offense may suffer. Under this part of the definition, only a person who has had an offense committed against them is a victim for the purposes of most criminal code provisions. The second part of the criminal code definition includes individuals other than the direct victim for the purposes of certain criminal code provisions, including the victim impact statement provisions. This is consistent with established case law that recognizes secondary victims for the purposes of these provisions. The Canadian Victim Bill of Rights does not apply to Canadians who are victims of offences committed outside of Canada, over which Canada is not exerting extraterritorial jurisdiction. This is because the rights under the Canadian Victims Bill of Rights all relate to the various stages of the Canadian criminal justice process, from the investigation and prosecution of an offence through to the conditional release process. For example, a victim's right to present a victim's impact statement, to have the court considering making a restitution order against an offender, or to request information about an offender, can only apply to offences processed through the Canadian criminal and corrections systems. It is not possible for Canada to extend those rights to people or to criminal justice processes that are within another country's jurisdiction. We have also heard concerns about differences between the definition of victim proposed in the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights and those found in provincial and territorial legislation. Each province and territory has enacted its own victims of crime legislation, which includes a definition of victim. Some provinces and territories have multiple definitions for various purposes, such as eligibility for specific services or financial benefits programs. Mr. Speaker, I note that this problem of various definitions of victim did not arise with Bill C-32, but is a result of the evolution of victim services in each jurisdiction. It is simply not possible to have one definition of victim at the federal level that would incorporate absolutely all the different definitions of victim that exist at the provincial and territorial level. Rather, the bill seeks to create a definition that is inclusive and that recognizes all the different forms of harm that victims may suffer as a result of an offense. These include physical or emotional harm, property damage, and economic loss. Most provincial and territorial definitions include similar elements in their definitions. I will now turn to the issue of ensuring that victims are able to exercise their rights under the Act, Mr. Speaker. The Justice Committee heard from witnesses who questioned how victims would be made aware of their new rights under this Act. This is a very fair question. All the rights in the world will not benefit victims if they don't know about them. A Government of Canada website will be developed making information on the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights available to all Canadians. During last year's consultations, numerous stakeholders stressed the importance of a one-stop shop for victims to access information. The Government of Canada website will meet that need. The committee also heard from several Aboriginal groups who are concerned that Aboriginal victims would not be able to exercise their rights in the same way as other victims. They noted the disproportionate impact of factors such as poverty, marginalization, and lack of safe housing of Aboriginal victims, and explained that they would therefore need extra support in order to fully exercise their rights in the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights. The government recognizes that every victim is different and has different needs. That is why Budget 2014 committed to providing funding to the provinces and territories to assist with the implementation of this bill. The government recognizes that the provinces and territories will play a crucial role in the effective implementation of this bill and has been working with them through various fora, such as meetings of the federal, provincial, territorial ministers responsible for justice and public safety, to address the implementation issues. We need to continue this work with our provincial and territorial partners to ensure that the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights brings about the changes in the criminal justice and correction systems that we have promised victims. Turning now to the issue of enforceability, Mr. Speaker, some have criticized Bill C-32 as nothing more than a statement of principle because they believe the enshrined rights to be unenforceable. This is simply not true. The Victim Bill of Rights includes a remedial scheme to address an infringement or denial of a victim's rights under the Act. This is what distinguishes Bill C-32 from many provincial or territorial victims acts, which have been found to be just statements of principle. Under Bill C-32, every federal department, agency, or body involved in the criminal justice system would be required to have a complaints mechanism in place that would review complaints and make recommendations to remedy any infringement or denial of a victim's right under the Act. And they would be required to inform victims of those recommendations. If a victim is unsatisfied with the recommendations made by the department, agency, or body, they could then raise the issue with an oversight agency where one exists, such as the RCMP Public Complaints Commission. Where no oversight body exists for a particular department, agency, or body, a victim could seek the assistance of the Office of the Federal Ombudsman for Victims of Crime, whose mandate includes reviewing concerns regarding non-compliance with legislation or established policies. Complaints regarding a provincial or territorial agency, including police, the Crown, or victim services, would be addressed in accordance with the applicable provincial or territorial legislation. In order to improve the remedies available to victims, the government will provide a limited amount of funding through the Victims Fund to provinces and territories to enhance or establish complaint bodies for victims of crime. Mr. Speaker, I hope members of all parties will join me in supporting the Victim Bill of Rights to ensure that victims of crime in Canada receive the recognition and protection that they deserve. Hear, hear.